On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Varun Madan. He is the head of engineering at OneHouse. We're going to be talking about operating with a slimmer margin. What do I mean? Well, when you're at a startup, there are slimmer margins. I mean, when you hire the wrong person versus hiring the right person, there's an impact. There's a window in which case you have to operate and be very efficient. And also when we're talking about context switching and making sure that you're focused on the right things, balancing that high level and being at the weeds at the same time, hopefully we'll get through all of that with Varun. Thanks for taking the time, man.
Thanks for having me, Amir. I appreciate it.
Tell us what OneHouse does before we dive into the show.
So we are basically in the data lakehouse space. So data lakehouses came about like 5 or so years ago. And the whole idea is the amount of data that's being generated out there is increasing exponentially. And the traditional ways we store data in warehouses and databases don't kind of scale at this level, especially for analytical workloads. So we basically are part of kind of a generation of this new style of storing data called data lakehouses. And we built a data lakehouse based on an Apache project called Apache Hoodie. And we built a managed service based on top of that.
Awesome. That seems like quite an interesting place to be right now. That's probably a whole episode on its own. In this podcast episode, we're going to be talking about really dealing and operating efficiently, right? And I think, we talked about that in a very few different areas and aspects. In this case, maybe we can start off when we're talking about operating with a slimmer margin. You are the head of engineering. When you're looking at that slim margin and where you're looking at impact, kind of talk to us about how that gets balanced, right? So obviously slim margin, you can make mistakes, but within a startup, you don't want to make too many, but also you have to take advantage of the opportunities. Talk to us about how you balance the two.
Yeah, at a high level, right? Like I think in a bigger company or in an organization that kind of has more time and money, like we kind of learn from our mistakes, and sometimes it's okay to kind of take the time to learn from them. But at our stage, right, we essentially need to be making an impact on a daily basis. So when I talk to my team, like on a weekly basis, every single one on my team has to be thinking about like what we delivered this week, right? And how does that impact like the value we deliver to our customers, to the community as well, because we also have open source products. So which basically leads to kind of that margin of error being like really, really slim, whether that's kind of on kind of making the technical decisions on how we operate our services or who we hire. We just have like less room to make that error because we need to kind of make sure we kind of making impact on a weekly basis. A week in our world is like a month or a quarter in a bigger company world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because as as things are moving quickly and things are dynamic, there are impacts, right? The one-way, two-way door. I understand all that. One of the biggest areas where I think companies try to, at least at the startup level, I think even big companies, but especially at the startup level, they try to focus very heavily is that hiring process. And sometimes to the point which, teams will wait indefinitely to make the right hire. Let's talk about that because I think there's an interesting component to that. And maybe talk to us about when you're looking at hiring and you're looking at obviously the overall impact to the team and talking about that right and wrong and kind of the ability to kind of be more patient. I guess talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've basically done like huge amount of hiring at bigger companies, right? I was like bar raiser at Amazon, like I did like over 500 interviews there. I kind of almost redesigned our engineering hiring process at Confluent. Having done all that, you would feel like, hey, you've done kind of a lot of hiring, you know how to do it. It's different. It's different at this stage, right? Like, I don't think I've fine-tuned the hiring process in any of those bigger companies as much as I've done over here. There's a few reasons for us, right? One, we need to be making sure kind of like every candidate we're taking into the pipeline is worth my team's time, because if my team is like interviewing them, then they're not spending their time actually building stuff, right? So working with especially the recruiting team, we've built like matrices where like every single like column has to be color coded based on the intros like the recruiters are doing. We try and calculate a score from there to see, hey, is this candidate worth our time or not? And a lot of times we basically do decide that like, hey, like this person only takes like 4 out of our 8 requirements. We're not going to talk to them. If this was a bigger company, we had more bandwidth, I was like, yeah, let's take the risk, let's do the interview and see. But over here, even the decision to kind of do the interviews or not, like we have to screen like a lot more tightly, because I have to preserve my team's time, right? So at every step of the hiring process, we just need to be like a lot more buttoned up, which is interesting again, right? Because to be buttoned up, you need to spend time. So you're kind of spending time in one place to try to save time in another place. But like the end of the thing is like you kind of look at the bigger picture and say, are we kind of how much time we're spending on hiring, like each part of the pipeline, but also like looking at people we hired, right? Like we kind of are a lot more critical about like giving that feedback back into the hiring process. If we kind of have a mishire or if we have great hires, that process kind of needs to kind of be complete. So overall, right, at the end of the day, we just have like very, very kind of like less space to make mistakes. So we have to be a little bit more choosy. We don't have the time to train people as you would have with boot camps and whatnot in bigger companies. We expect people to come up with certain skills. Now, it's not always that like, hey, we always look for the unicorn, because then like you won't be able to hire, right? Because at the end of the day, I do need people on my team. I need good people who are kind of building. So we kind of consciously think about what are the skills that can be learned in a period of, let's say, like 1 to 3 months. And those skills, maybe I'm okay if the person doesn't have, and we're going to focus on that person building that skill once they join.
And I think that's really interesting. So, and maybe talk a little bit about, obviously there's an investment in time. There's a skill you're looking for. There's a precise type of, a person that you think will be a fit. And there's also duration of time in which this process can take. And I always find it interesting because there's a definitive balance as to, well, if the process takes 7 or 8 months, could someone come in? Could someone ramp up? Could someone hit that level? Or is it a case of if that skill and aptitude isn't there, then hiring for that person, even if you give them ramp up time, isn't necessarily going to help your team?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of gone through, especially if we're in the data space. So the actual like the skill set, the people out there is smaller than like hiring general like software engineers. So we've kind of gone through that process of figuring out like what are the skills that we absolutely need. Even like another example is like if I was hiring for Amazon, like I don't care so much about what languages you code in, because it's like fine, you can come and learn because like people learn it, right? But in our case, like depends on how many things you have to learn, right? So if you are not coding in our language of choice, if you don't come from the data space, like all that kind of piles up, right? So we have to figure out, okay, how many things can this person learn? So there are some positions for us which have been open for a while, especially when we look for kind of like these deep data engineers, right? But instead of kind of lowering the bar on that and say, hey, let's hire somebody, what we've done is we've tried to create like alternate profiles. And I've seen this work well, even at Confluent. It's like, hey, I'm looking for this like staff level deep data person, but can I like get in the meantime a good software engineers who has worked on some data system, might not be deep, but is more on the junior side, who can like ramp up quickly, spend more time on kind of gathering the skills they need, while we look for this one senior person, right? So we kind of like try and create like parallel paths and kind of be very explicit, like, okay, in this role, we are kind of looking for a slightly different profile. So rather than like lowering the bar of that particular profile, I like to create like a parallel profile that complements the profile we're looking for. So we keep looking for the senior person, but we at least hired a couple more junior people, and then when it all comes together, it's all good.
Yeah, I guess, and I think that makes a lot of sense. How do you help your team get more efficient in that process, right? So obviously that time is going to take away. There's an opportunity cost. Is there, in terms of efficiency, being able to gain some to help the team get more efficient in that process to reduce the false positives and whatnot?
Yeah, so quicker feedback, collecting data at every space. So like we kind of like, again, as I said, like I think we collect more data over here on our pipeline than we kind of have done in my previous places. So like at every step, we kind of look at every time we do any change to the process, we look at like, hey, what is the conversion rate from this stage of the pipeline to the other stage, right? Getting feedback from the interviewing team as well, like what's most efficient? Does every interview need to be 60 minutes? Can we do this in 45 minutes? What are you going to lose? So it's a continuous learning process, kind of driven by data and like a full feedback loop, right? Throughout the pipeline.
It's interesting because as you've been talking about that process and getting that feedback back, and you mentioned there are slimmer margins and this time is very important. When you are having to go through the interviewing process, your team, that context switching, I know, is not something engineers like. What have you seen work or well when it comes to context switching, and maybe specifically when it comes to interviewing and going through that process of having to move between these different tasks? Have you seen something that's helped or worked or benefited the team?
So I think on interviewing specifically, it's about kind of making sure we all align on the goals, right? So like sometimes engineers might end up thinking, oh, interviews is taking away from our time. But like if they're thinking like that, then I need to kind of step in and kind of have that discussion of like, hey, this is kind of part of growing the company and building the product, right? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to scale our team. We're not going to be able to build more products, right? So I think having that shared goal, shared understanding, the recruiting team and the engineering team, they work together. I can't think of these as like separate parts of the company, especially not at this stage, right? So I think that's the primary thing. Yes, there's a context switch. We all kind of understand, but if people like kind of understand the motivation behind it and why they're doing it, I think it takes a lot of that at least mental burden and pain away, right? And that goes for like a lot of other things in which like people have to do something which is not traditionally a part of the skill they were hired for, till the time they understand why we as a company are doing it, right? Personally, for me, I think it's just part of the job. Like I'm kind of going back and forth between like I'm kind of running sprints for like three teams, and I have like another person in like director level person in India, kind of going through different contexts, jumping from engineering to like customers to recruiting to operations. So for me, I think I don't know, it's part of training my brain. Like I've kind of have time allocated specifically on my calendar on things that I need to do. And I guess maybe that helps as well. So I know that, hey, for the next hour, I'm going to be in an operational focus. For the next hour, I'm going to be in a hiring focus. Like things I have to do every day rather than kind of like hoping that kind of blends into the other things that I'm doing, kind of explicitly booking time for these things to happen, right?
I like that. And I guess maybe a question, a follow up to that is as you've kind of progressed in your career, you mentioned being able to block out different times for different things. How have you improved in terms of defending that calendar? Because I think it's obviously I think a lot of people, their goal is to kind of make sure they kind of have those blocks, but also you have to learn to say it's not going to be done now. I have something else. Like how what have you kind of done in your career to kind of improve defending that calendar time for yourself?
It's a continuous process of like slipping and feeling the pain and improving, right? So I would say I'm perfect at it, but whenever I see like, hey, I'm like not doing these things that I have time blocked for, it's like, why is that happening? Because I'm just taking interviews, I'm taking other meetings on top of it, right? And kind of like on a weekly basis, like consciously kind of thinking about it and then readjusting your calendar, right? Sometimes those blocks are in a time where people really need you in the office, right? So sometimes I need to do that block early in the morning or late in the evening. So I'm not kind of getting pinged for it. But I don't think like from what I felt in my experience that like it always works. You just block that slot, it's always going to work. I need to kind of keep kind of readjusting, look at my calendar on a weekly basis, saying, hey, somebody like booked over this. Can I move this someplace else? Right. Otherwise, like I'm not going to get to it.
Yeah, I mean that's actually, I think, yeah, you've got to slip and fall a couple times and realize, those are the constraints. I guess as we're kind of talking about this notion of within startups, you do have a slimmer margin, right? I guess if you're at a bigger company, you probably would listen to this and go, well, I don't have a big margin either. I guess your impact is seen differently, right? Maybe that's where really we're talking about is that impact is seen differently. You have worked at different companies. You're obviously head of engineering at OneHouse. When you talk about that impact and when you think about the visibility, when you have less people, there's less places to hide. Not that we're hiding, but obviously when things do go wrong, things are visible. Like the CEO is going to definitely know. If you work at Amazon, the CEO will know unless it's like catastrophic. Most of the time they won't find out. Sure, managers will. Talk to us a little bit about when we talk about margin of error, we talk about the visibility, we talk about impact. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think at the end of the day, for me, setting expectations with my team that everything they're doing is measured in impact. Yes, like effort kind of counts, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't kind of get to an impact, it doesn't matter, right? So if all of us kind of are in that mentality of like, am I actually driving impact? Mistakes happen, and I think that's okay. I think if it's an environment where we not don't have a blame culture, right, where we make mistakes, we learn from it, and like we have a transparent postmortem process where like you write down the mistake you made. We don't actually focus on like whose mistake it was, but focus on what the mistake was and how we can learn from it. And every week we kind of talk through those and discuss that as at a company level. Anybody can come attend those meetings, and the whole idea is that we're learning from each other's mistakes, right? So being transparent about mistakes at any level, I think is good. So we all learn from our mistakes and then focusing on the overall impact that we're making, right?
You mentioned, obviously, we talked about, a blameless culture. When you are hiring engineers and they're coming on board, for them to truly absorb and accept that this is a blameless culture, they have to see it, right? Because obviously, a lot of times people go, well, sure, you're telling me it's a blameless culture until I make a mistake. How do you help the engineers on your team understand that mistakes, obviously different degree of mistakes, but mistakes are part of the process?
I think it's just involving them in the process, right? So these meetings that talk about like you join, you attend those meetings from day one. And I think we reiterate like, hey, like if you make a mistake, that's fine. Till the time you're learning from it, right? Like making a mistake twice, okay, now maybe we're getting into a territory you're not even fine. Third time, probably if you made the same mistake. Like at Amazon, we used to say like even making a mistake second time is not okay. So I think just being like open and transparent about the process, like having that in our values, in engineering values, where like they see that happening in like just telling people sometimes is not going to actually make it like internalized, but actually them seeing it in action, where none of our like documents we write for postmortems, like they don't really name people or anything, right? It's more about like, hey, how are we improving the process? And even as new hires, right, we encourage people to ask questions over there, right? Because a lot of times that fresh pair of eyes, like we might have gotten used to a certain error happening all the time, but that fresh pair of eyes like, hey, why are you guys not like fixing this, right? So I think everybody from day one is kind of like encouraged to be a part of that process.
I guess as we're kind of talking about, the main theme is dealing with slimmer margins, operating with slimmer margins. I guess yourself, as the head of engineering, your relationship with the CEO, with leadership, when you're working through your relationships and you're trying to convey your value, the pressures, obviously that balance of trying to deliver that relationship, obviously you're working for a tech company, so it's a little bit different. But when you kind of talk about your value, how do you highlight your value to the leaders that you report to? And the reason I'm asking is sometimes I think it's one of the hardest places because you are responsible for a lot, but it's not necessarily your delivery, right? But showing value is always, everyone's trying to show value. How do you think you show value best in your role?
I think that's generally a problem in kind of like leadership, right? And I struggle with that when I moved from being an IC to a manager role. Is like as an IC, I could clearly say like I did these Jira tasks and they're done. But as a leader, like it's like, hey, what did I get done, right? Because like at the end of the day, if your team's doing great, like it's like you have to kind of put them forward and saying, hey, my team delivered this, right? If they mess something up, it's your problem as a leader, right? Like you should have kind of got that and fixed that. But But I think at the end of the day, what my team delivers, it's we all delivering that together, right? So just like again, going back to kind of focusing on the final value being delivered, because it's pretty clear to like my leadership as well, right? That a lot of these projects are not like even coming out of a single team. They need coordination with product management. They need coordination with other teams, with some of the customer success teams and the sales team. So like I'm kind of the glue that's kind of like tying all those things together. If I'm not doing it, yes, all those teams will probably kind of deliver on their individual goals, but like the overall impact would not happen, right? So kind of just understanding that, and then also like we are a very open culture, transparent culture. So like even like I'm working on a bunch of Jiras, right? Even if that's a process improvement I'm doing, I'm actually writing that down. That hey, this week I was working on this process improvement that helped improve like the efficiency of like how we plan for our sprints or something like that, right? So we kind of like try and track everybody's work, not just kind of the engineers.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned, as you're becoming an IC to leader, one of the challenges was being able to kind of show that value, demonstrate that value. I guess if you were to look back at your career, and you've worked, I guess, for different companies, so you have the benefit of some of that experience and exposure. Is there anything that you would look back and you would tell individual contributor Varun to focus on more, as you know now you've gone through the leadership process?
I don't know if personally me, but I think I've generally seen ICs who've kind of gone to management and come back to ICs actually end up being stronger ICs. So even when I was an IC, I would say don't be shy to kind of dip your toes into understanding how the end-to-end process works. Don't be shy to kind of understanding how even things in marketing and sales work, right? Like don't just be kind of like in your corner writing your code, because you'll be a lot more efficient engineer if you are kind of keeping the end-to-end picture in mind.
I like that. Actually, that's interesting because I think I've seen. I actually had somebody else talk to me about some of the benefits of going back to being an IC and the visibility and how they had a different appreciation having been an engineering manager, because obviously you're dealing with a whole different layer. So actually, I think that's really interesting. And actually, I was going to ask you maybe a follow up to that. When you do see people go back, right? They're a manager, they go back to being an IC, and then they want to become an engineering manager. Is there? I mean, I think it should be okay. I think that's the answer. But is there something they can do to highlight that? Because I think in a lot of cases, people will ask the question of, what didn't work out the first time? Why'd you want to be an IC? Because maybe typically it doesn't have the best stigma. How do you think is best maybe to phrase, or how do you think best is to maybe approach that so that it's looked in the best light?
I've actually seen a couple of people do that in my career who I worked closely with. And I think most of them kind of went back to IC to kind of making sure they still know how to do the day-to-day job, especially when they change teams. So they were a manager in one team and then moved to a second team. So instead of moving as a manager into the second team, they moved as an IC. So, and their idea was like, I need to kind of understand the deep details before I start managing the team, right? In one of the cases, that person ended up continuing to be an IC because they were having so much fun being an IC. In the other case, in 6 months, it's like, hey, now I'm ready to kind of go back into like that leadership role, right? So I think that's usually one of like a good motivation. It's like you go to a new space. I want to learn the space before I start managing the space, right?
Yeah, I like. I mean, that's really great advice, to be honest with you. I think I've seen it come up a bit more over the last couple of years, especially with the market kind of being iffy for engineering the last year and a half. People are going back to be an IC role. I think it's going to be interesting as new opportunities arise and they want to get into management again. I think it'll be an interesting way of positioning that. I think your advice is very good. I was going to ask you, if somebody wants to kind of tap you on your shoulder, kind of ask you a follow-up question on anything you've mentioned, is there a good way of getting a hold of you, getting in touch with you?
Sure. I think LinkedIn's probably the best. Also on X, either works.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely put your some of those handles in the show notes, and if somebody's interested, they could definitely reach out, follow up with you. Varun, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for kind of diving in and talking about some of these topics. I think great insights. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think Varun did a great job. We kind of talked a little bit about operating in the startup, having a little bit slimmer margin. We talked about interviewing, some of the context switching that goes along with it, how he handles his calendar, advice to people in terms of what you're going to do if you have to go from IC to leader and back to IC, and how to kind of deal with that if you want to get into another management or leadership role. I think Varun covered a lot of different topics for us, so I thought that was great. Please share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. I thank you in advance if you do that. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.